If there is anybody in the Senate absolutely dedicated to actually shrinking the size of the federal government, it's you.
I don't think the people up here represent the people very well. I think our greatest threat to our country is from within.
I kept being told we risked the shutdown and the shutdown would interrupt the work that Doge was doing.
But why wouldn't they want to incorporate the Doge cuts into the spending bill? This goes on time after time after time again.
But most people don't need an explanation for why you don't need to, fund trans operas in Colombia.
No conservative watching this program is for that. People need to be prepared. The swamp always wins. Even when you think you're beating the swamp beats you.
Okay, real quick before we get started, two things. First, the whole reason for doing these interviews is because we wanted to give you guys some insight into what members of Congress are thinking about how Doge is going to be able to implement all of the things that they want to through the legislature. Now, as we had this interview with Rand Paul, the continuing resolution debate was going on, and Rand Paul was one of the people that voted against the continuing resolution. And so we give him an opportunity to give his argument on why he did that. Later on, you're going to see another episode from a different senator who voted for the continuing resolution, and he gave his opinion. Now, one of the things that we've been dedicated to doing through all of these Doge Talks episodes is we're going to give you guys definitions of the things that we're talking about, because there's a lot of discussion about continuing resolutions and reconciliation and rescission and what does it all mean. We explain it all here so you guys can follow along, pause if you need to, read the definitions, and then we also give action items on the various ways that you can interact to be able to affect the sort of change you would like to see.
Today we are talking with Senator Rand Paul. Thank you, Senator.
Glad to be with you. Yeah, I think the thing about Doge, what's great is, they're talking about the waste that I've been pointing out for a decade now. But the reason my experience is important in this is pointing it out isn't enough.
Yeah.
Now they're canceling contracts, they're doing a lot of good things, but we need to see it represented in less spending. And so the problem is that so far it's all sort of happening in the executive branch, but none of it's coming back to us. And so when spending proposals come forward, as these spending proposals come forward, there needs to be an incorporation of spending cuts to reflect what Elon Musk, Doge is doing. Secretary Rubio canceled 83% of the foreign aid contracts. That needs to be reflected in the spending. That's why I've been proposing all along. We need to vote on it. Republicans need to do it. It doesn't need any Democrat votes. We can actually cut some of the spending by a simple majority, but Republicans have to be brave enough to vote for it.
Now, the whole argument that took place on the CR when the House voted on it was all about, hey, we've got to get fiscal year 25 kind of behind us and in the books. We can talk about doing rescission later with some of the stuff that was already done, but Joe Biden front-loaded all the spending and just give us a clean bill so we don't shut down the government. What's the argument against that?
That's the swamp. That's what the swamp says, and that's what the swamp always says. This CR that was just addressed were the Biden spending levels. The CR in December, 30 conservative Republicans voted against it. And it passed with Democrat supports and big government Republican supports, and the conservatives voted no. This is the same CR. They haven't changed any numbers, very minuscule. It's essentially the same spending levels. These are the Biden spending levels. At the end of the year, the spending levels from the recent CR will give us a $2.2 trillion deficit. So if you vote for this spending, you're voting for $5 trillion in revenue and $7 trillion in spending. No conservative out there in the countryside, no conservative watching this program is for that. I don't know why anybody would consider voting for that.
And yet we saw what happened with the administration and House leadership. They were adamant, like, this is what President Trump wants.
I know, but here's a counter or an alternative history that could have happened. In the Senate, it takes 50 Republicans plus the vice president. So if 4 Republicans said no and said it's not enough spending cuts, they would have to come to us and ask us what they want. Because it was just me, there wasn't any, I didn't have any leverage, but people say, oh, well, you'd have to have 50. No, all I had to have was 3 more. If 3 people would have supported me in opposing the CR, they would have had to negotiate with us. 4 people could sit down with the Speaker of the House. 4 people could sit down with the President and say, we need to go back to pre-pandemic levels.
So this is what the argument seemed like it was to me. It was, well, if we do that, we don't have enough votes, and now we're going to have a government shutdown.
Well, no, we do this to please the left wing of our party. So the big spenders get what they want, but the conservatives got nothing and voted for it. See, if the Freedom Caucus meant anything, and if they were going to do anything, they should have withheld 30 votes and said, negotiate with us. They got nothing. The spending's the same level. These are the Biden spending levels. This will be a $2 trillion deficit. And come September, people in the Freedom Caucus are going, well, damn, they said they were going to cut spending later. They always say, we'll do it next time. Yeah. But this goes on time after time after time again. It can't be trusted, Republican or Democrat. President Trump has good instincts. Mm-hmm. And he could have been, I think, led to a different outcome with cuts in spending. But it takes courage for people to stand up. 4 people could have stood up and said, the liberals don't get everything they want. You're not going to get the Biden spending levels. For example, I would have said go back to pre-pandemic levels. That would have been $400 billion less. The spending bill was for $1.6 trillion. I'd have gone to 1.2. But you say, well, you can't get everything you want. The progressives in your party want more spending. So why don't we split the difference? I want 1.2. They wanted 1.6. What about 1.4? That would have been $200 billion. $200 billion is not an insignificant amount. That's a decent amount of a cut. And I might have voted for the spending bill. They say, oh, you'll never vote for anything. You got to cut spending. You have to be on a plan to reduce the deficit, not increase the deficit.
So what's if you had to steel man the argument? What's the argument for waiting till September? Like, was it genuine concern that
the swamp always wins. Even when you think you're beating the swamp beats you. But you have to realize there's some countervailing currents beneath the surface. There are Republicans, and I just came from a Republican caucus meeting where the discussion is we need to spend 5% of our GDP on defense. Well, they're not willing to cut any Medicaid or Medicare or anything like that, but they want 5% on defense. Well, that means the deficit will be bigger. Unless more tax revenue comes in, they are for increasing the deficit. There are many who are for more spending for the border. So the bill that's being pushed primarily by Senator Graham on this side has been an increase of military spending $150 billion and an increase of border spending $175 billion. So we're talking about over a $300 billion increase in spending. There's also another 40, 50, maybe $100 billion for fires in California lurking out there. We just added $100 billion at Christmas time for North Carolina. Yeah. So the problem is there are people on the Republican side who believe and want more spending. And to me, where I disagree with the neoconservatives is I think our greatest threat to our country is from within. I think we should be prepared. We should have a strong national defense. We should have a nuclear deterrence. But I don't think, China's coming across the ocean to attack us. No. I don't think Russia's coming across the ocean. Yeah. I don't think Europe's coming. Don't think Mexico's coming. And I'm for what the president's doing on the border, but he did that with barely $1. Mm-hmm. He did that with existing resources. Yeah. He told Mexico, you're going to get tariffs or put the army down there. They did. Yeah. Now, then he should have come to an agreement. Instead, he's still threatening the tariffs and still adding tariffs. Yeah. But the threat was actually a good one. Yeah. And he actually got the army mobilized. Yeah. He told Canada, stop the fentanyl. They agreed to help more. Yeah. But once you get another country to do something, we should accept the deal and try to then establish relations again. Instead, the president continues to add tariffs on top of after he already got them to change their behavior.
All right, if you are anything like us, you have probably gotten a little bit frustrated with typical search engines and the way they curate the news, generally from only one perspective. So do what we've done. We're now using Ground News, and lo and behold, I'm about to interview Rand Paul, so what did I do? I typed in Rand Paul, and it turns out Ground News has a page dedicated to just him. Not to mention the fact that since we're talking about Doge, I can look up that page as well, and instantly, I have numerous articles that are all curated for me, not to mention the fact giving me the various perspectives that they're coming from. So if I want to search it from the left, center, or right, it makes it incredibly easy to do so. I've got all of my basic stats here that make my research incredibly easy. Now, Ground News is a website and an app that gathers related articles in one place so you can compare headlines, helping you to understand not just what's happening, but who's telling the story and why. So, if, like us, you are somewhat frustrated with the way typical search engines curate the news where you only get one perspective, go over to ground.news/Doge and check out all of the different features they provide. In fact, if you go over right now to ground.news/Doge, you can get 40% off the Vantage plan, which will give you access to all the features you need to keep track of everything that is going on. Get 40% off of Ground News Vantage plan, which gives you unlimited access to their website when you go to, once again, ground.news/Doge. Go check it out.
So shifting a little bit from the CR, because look, I'm frustrated by that too, because I keep trying to figure out why we couldn't have cuts in this CR. And again,
lack of willpower. Okay,
I kept being told that really what this was is that we risked the shutdown, and the shutdown would interrupt the work that Doge was doing. And so that sounded like, okay, if that's true, I understand where you're coming from. But again, I still haven't been able to figure out why can't we
Why wouldn't they want to incorporate the Doge cuts into the spending bill?
Yeah.
You have a spending bill.
Yeah.
Nothing stopping them other than lack of votes.
So
there's two wings that pull the party.
Yeah.
There's the big spending wing, and then there's the fiscal conservatives.
Yeah.
The fiscal conservatives went along with it, a lot of them, and the big spenders got what they wanted. No decrease in spending. Basically, a CR that continues 4 and 8 at the same level.
Yeah.
All the stuff of trans opera, trans comic book, sex change operations in Guatemala, all funded at the same level.
So do they think that they're going to be able to either stop that at the executive level, or that they're going to be able to yank some of it back through rescission?
There's a debate on this.
Yeah.
There's a debate on whether if we don't spend it, can we impound it?
Yeah.
There's a law that says you can't impound it that was passed in the 1970s to rein in Nixon's activities. It has been tried at the lower court level and has been basically continued in action. There are those in the Trump administration who say it's unconstitutional. It would have to go to the Supreme Court. But I can tell you last week, it did go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Not all of the issue, but at least tangentially the issue. And they ruled 5-4 to send it back to the lower court that has already ruled that the Trump administration has to spend the money.
Yeah, that's the $2 billion.
Now, the Impoundment Act that says presidents can't impound it gave the president a special vehicle for sending it back to Congress through something called rescission. It's a privileged vote, goes right back to Congress, and it can't be filibustered. So just Republicans alone could cut this spending. But see, it's a tug of war. The Trump administration believes they can just impound it and they're going to win at the Supreme Court. So they're not wanting to send rescission back to us because they don't want to lose on a rescission vote or expend the energy. They think they can just impound it. And if they're successful, God love them, that's great. But there are many people saying they're not going to be successful and eventually going to need to do rescission. And then the president, who is popular, who I do support, could use his popular energy to come down here and lobby Congress, not to continue spending at the same level, but to actually cut spending.
Now, forgive my ignorance on this, but with the CR vote, is that filibuster? I mean, could someone filibuster the CR vote?
Yeah, so in order to get the continuing resolution through, it's a simple majority in the House, and it takes 60 in the Senate.
So can I ask this question from a process battle? Can they successfully argue that the reason why you had to go with the CR as it currently was because you could get it out of the way, and then you could go with rescission, which is just a straight up majority,
right?
Whereas you risk a filibuster on the CR and then the shutdown. Like, is that, again, if we're steel manning the argument, is that the best?
If you're going back and forth, that is an argument for never doing anything. You can't get it without Democrats.
Yeah.
And it would have been a fight. And then the question is, how hard do you push the fight? Yeah. So, for example, the CR did have things, the continuing resolution had spending levels the Democrats don't like, but in the end, the Democrats will swallow that and they will vote for it because they don't want to be accused of shutting down the government either. So in the end, most of these things go through, but the bottom line is people need to be prepared. Come September, the people watching your program, conservatives, libertarians around the country are going to go, well, gosh, I thought we were cutting all this money and the deficit's still $2.2 trillion. It may be more because they're wanting to spend another $300 to $400 billion. If they spend $400 billion more, now we're talking about 2.4, maybe $2.6 trillion deficit.
Let me ask you this, because that's a great point. And we have had members say, look, here's the things you got to look for. You got to look for what the House and the Senate is doing with the 12 appropriation bills. If the 12 appropriation bills are not done by July, there's probably no way you're getting this done. And if they're drastically different and everything has to go to conference, you're probably not getting any of this done by September. So those are areas to watch, and areas where, again, we're encouraging our audience to reach out to their representatives. There's one other thing I want to ask about, because I'm trying to get something a little bit more concrete here. And that is, if there is anybody in the Senate that I know is absolutely dedicated to actually shrinking the size of the federal government, it's you. So here's my question. What do you think the process looks like, whether it's coordinated with Doge or coordinated with the administration, to actually not just make certain departments more efficient, but to get rid of departments that should never exist on the federal level anyways?
You've got to send reinforcements. There aren't enough of us.
Okay.
And so I
You
can
think
tell
even
you,
with Trump getting people to step in
no, and I
line,
mean
or-
that's what's great about Trump, frankly, is he's a bull in a china shop, and he's shaking up and doing everything he can to disrupt the swamp. I mean, he's doing a great job with that, but he doesn't have enough among the people. The people support it. Like Department of Education, yeah, that's been in our platform. Getting rid of it has been in our platform since Reagan, and yet if you ask for the votes here, there's about 20 votes maybe in the Senate, 20 Republicans, 30 will vote to keep it. There are people in here, and I won't name their names, but who ran originally on getting rid of the Department of Education now would never vote to cut a penny for the Department of Education.
There's two things that our audience wants to know. One is what is really going on, and what does everyone mean when they talk about CRs and rescission? And I think over the last several episodes we've talked about all that. The second one is what can they actually do about it? Now, I'm a big believer that new media, and specifically X, showed its power in December with the other continuing resolution debate.
Which is the same as this one.
Yes.
But it's getting a different outcome.
Yeah.
And the only thing different is there's a Republican president.
Yeah.
So the Republican president has a strong enough presence and is popular enough that he goes to Republicans and says, I don't want to deal with this headache. It just gets in my way. But he could do alternative. He could say, let's say 30 members of the House Freedom Caucus had stood up to him, and 4 or 5 senators. I stood up, but pretty much alone. But if I had 4 or 5 allies, we stand up and we say to the president, we're with you. We support Doge. We support the cuts. We want to make them real. We want to make them part of this. And we'd like to take the spending level that was negotiated under Biden and reduce it by 5%.
Okay.
If you actually reduce spending by 5 or 6%, on everything, you balance the budget in 5 years.
So let me ask you this. We're going to encourage our audience focus on if there's no rescission bills, if those aren't going forward, that's a big indicator that all of this, the rescission argument was a ruse. That's a big indicator. If the appropriations bills are not done by July or the end of July, that's a big indicator. Here's the other one, and this one is super important to me as someone that, again, I look at the Constitution, I look at the enumerated powers of the federal government, and I see a bureaucracy which far outstrips anything they were ever designed to do. Who are the people that you believe will be carrying the bills to when it, I know, for instance, you've carried some of these, Massey's carried some of these, you've carried the REINS Act. The REINS Act is an incredibly important structural change of the way that the federal government does work. What are the bills that you see carrying either getting rid of departments or significantly decreasing them or consolidating that we should be watching?
So rescission is where the president gets together spending cuts and sends them back to us, and it's a privileged vote, simple majority. There's also something, it's all these arcane terms, there's something called reconciliation, and that's yet a different process, but it's still a simple majority. It's part of the budget process, and there are strict rules in the Senate on what you can cut. It's mostly, if not exclusively, mandatory spending, not discretionary. So it's a different pile of money. So the foreign aid grants, that's discretionary. That won't be part of reconciliation. So the things to watch are what you're saying, reconciliation, rescission, but also reconciliation. So through reconciliation, we want to make the tax cuts permanent from 2017, but there also will be spending cuts included in that package as well. So that's something to watch for, is do they have real spending cuts, and how much of them go along with making the tax cuts permanent?
What makes, forgive me again, because when you think budget bill, I just think budget bill. Like I vote on budget bills in the Virginia House. We don't have reconciliation. Like what is it?
So there was a Budget Act of 1974, and it created this. And it said that if they wanted to make sure that budgets got through easier.
Okay.
So if you're doing a budget, they wanted to make it, you couldn't filibuster a budget because every nation should have a budget. So they made it a simple majority vote. But then people started attaching things to the budget, like a tax cut or a spending increase. And so then there's a ruling. The parliamentarian gets to rule whether it can go in or out of it. And it's an arcane process, and nobody really understands it. And you take something and you go before the parliamentarian who wasn't elected to anything, has never run for office, and she makes the decision on what's allowed in the bill. But the bill is used because we rarely can do anything because the Democrats aren't for cutting taxes or cutting spending, so it'll be a simple majority. So reconciliation is a budgetary process, but we did tax cuts in 2017 by reconciliation, passed only by Republicans. They're expiring because of some other arcane bean counting rule up here. They're expiring. We want to make them permanent because we think they were good for the economy. To make them permanent, it's going to go through reconciliation again. It'll be a simple majority vote, but there's also going to be spending cuts included in there. And then the president and some of the Republicans want to put a debt ceiling increase of $4 trillion in there. I'm all for the tax cuts, but I've told them I'm not voting for the debt ceiling increase. I haven't voted for any of the spending. I'm not for big government. I'm for eliminating the departments of education, energy, all this stuff. I think we should make government a lot smaller. So I'm not going to vote to raise the debt ceiling to help them fund these programs that I'm not for. In the past, the debt ceiling has always passed with Democrats, because they vote for all the spending, and the big government Republicans, 10 or 15 of them, have to go on board. They don't like it. But to me, it's a day of shame that they deserve. We don't make them strip down and hit them with fruit. We probably should. But it's a day of shame where they walk to the front and they have to vote for big government. And they've voted for the spending. Almost every Republican that goes down there to vote to raise the debt ceiling, they are the big spenders. And they're usually on the appropriations. So it's good if we pass appropriation bills, but if they all pass unanimously with a 5% increase in spending, then not so good either.
All right, well, another thing that we talk a lot about here is obviously, and so far I think this has been done fairly well, and that is Doge has accomplished things that I think were very similar to what you were accomplishing, again, with those Festivus reports. It was the idea of, we're going to highlight the most absurd. There's a lot of cutting I would like to see that would be more likely to raise eyebrows or need a greater explanation. But most people don't need an explanation for why you don't need to, fund trans operas in Colombia. So we want to continue to actually put out that message. You do a very good job of explaining this other side of it that I think more people don't understand. They're at where you're at. But
I think a lot of people are perplexed by this. They want to support President Trump. They have been supportive of him. I support him. Look, I love a lot of his cabinet, most of his cabinet members. I'm for. He says he wants to balance the budget. I'm for that. He's for this tax cut. I'm for that. But the thing is that they're slashing and dashing their way through the bureaucracy. All good. But the money to be saved ultimately has to go back to the Treasury. If the money's sitting around in the executive branch, like I've let go these workers and I've stopped these stupid foreign aid grants, so where is the money? It's sort of sitting here. If it's judged to be impounded and illegal, they'll make him spend it somewhere else and he won't be able to give it back. To give it back so the Treasury, so we have less of a debt, less of a deficit, he has to send it through a special vehicle rescission back. I think they're resisting this now because I think the Trump administration is going to argue they can impound it and that the act was unconstitutional, and they're going to go before and get a final ruling in the Supreme Court. But people need to be prepared that come September, particularly if the impoundment is upheld and they can't impound it, we've either got to have rescission or we're going to have a $2 trillion deficit. And I predict we're going to have a $2 trillion deficit. And I don't want to be at the end of 4 years thinking, gosh, I loved everything he was doing. It's sounded so good. How come the deficit went up another $8 trillion?
Well, and I think the other important part people need to recognize is that so far most of what they like has happened through executive order. And if that's where it stays, I got bad news. The moment another president comes in, this is all done.
But it's not an argument to give up. It's an argument for people that are watching this show to get more involved. We need better Republicans. Frankly, the Republican districts where it's all Republicans, I mean, needs to challenge the Republican there. I'm not saying who it is, but you know who they are. They need to be challenged, and we need to have more conservative. I don't think the people up here represent the people very well. I think the people are way more conservative up here. So if you talked about how many people want to send another $100 billion to Ukraine, I think at home it's zero. You poll Republicans, it's probably zero. You poll Democrats, might be half of them want to send more because they don't care about the debt or anything. But the vast majority of the public doesn't want to send any more money to Ukraine because we have to borrow it from China to send it to Ukraine.
Where can people find you and follow everything that you're doing on social media?
Everywhere. Facebook, Twitter, randpaul.com. I mean, there's a lot of ways. We're on most social media platforms. And our biggest following is on Twitter. We have about 6 million people on Twitter, and we're pretty active on there on a daily basis. Things that I read or my staff brings to me, we tweet the articles out a lot of times with a little opinion, but also trying to show people the things that I'm interested in and discovering.
Oh, and here's the thing I want to let everybody know as well. There are going to be fights. There are going to be fights in between Republicans. We're used to fights with the Democrats, and we're all on board for those, and they're a ton of fun. But we're going to see more fights among Republicans. And here's what I wanted the audience to remember. There's going to be times where you need to look at the history. And if you've had someone like Senator Rand Paul that has been fighting this fight long before we had a president that was actually willing to fight it alongside him, that's not the guy you turn on the moment something in the news tells you to. These are the guys that we do need to give special deference to because they were willing to do this stuff when it was horribly unpopular. And now we got a lot of other people, which look, God bless them. I'm glad they saw the light. I'm glad they're starting to come over. I'm glad they're starting to talk about cutting government in meaningful ways. But if you've been a Republican, you've been disappointed before by your elected representatives. So we need to start looking at the ones that haven't disappointed us so that they can give us insight in the sort of fights that we're about to have, and the best way that we can weigh in, either with your own representative or on social media. But we need to be able to amplify those voices so that we can actually get what we need. And look, I'm not talking about beating people up, although sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes it's just about showing appreciation for the people that are doing the work, so everybody else can realize that if they want that same appreciation, they need to have the same sort of courage.
Okay, let's do a quick summary. One, whether or not you agree with Rand's comments on the continuing resolution, here's what I'll tell you. I think Rand's concerns are very, very warranted. And I trust Senator Paul because as long as I've known him, he has been fighting the good fight on this, even when he's had to fight his own party. Two, I think it's really important that we pay very close attention to what Senator Paul was saying about rescissions, because here's the deal. If we trust that the reason why the CR had to pass was because they wanted to get through that portion and now get on to things like the rescissions and preparing for fiscal year 26, okay, fine. But if we don't start seeing rescission bills in Congress, that's the part where we need to start being a little bit concerned. So I thank Senator Paul for cueing us in on that. Please leave us your feedback on how we can improve, or maybe some people you would like us to interview. Once again, Doge Watch, every Wednesday, we give you a quick summary of everything Doge has been doing for the week. And Doge Talks will be airing on Saturdays, where we actually talk to the various influencers and members of the legislature and administration in order to find out what is actually going to be happening with Doge for the long term. If you want to keep up to date to all the things that are going on, both with Doge Watch and Doge Talks, you can do that by clicking right here. Once again, thank you very much, and we'll see you next episode.